Hi. If you watched Mayday Homestay Gay Play, the 20th anniversary Queer as Folk cast and crew reunion, all to raise money for Centerlink, you may have seen an interview in there with Queer as Folk US creators Ron Cowan, Dan Lippman, and some of their writers, Brad Frazier, Del Shore, and Michael McLennan. This is a longer version of the interview you saw during the show. If you like what you see, if you're a fan of Queer as Folk, please consider making a donation to Centerlink down below. They are the hub of LGBTQ plus centers all across the US, into Canada, and throughout the world. Thank you. You look good. Look at you two.
So do you.
You sound surprised. Did
You
you
look-
expect to see corpses? What did you think we were going to look like?
You thought we were going to have beards like Rip Van Winkle?
Exactly. Well, so here's Michael McLennan. Can you see him?
I'm just grading my art right now.
Let me bring- let me
Look
bring-
at you. Hello.
This is great.
Hi.
And there's Brad.
Hello, from Toronto.
There's
Brad.
Can you hear
Hi,
me?
Brad.
And here's
Yeah.
Del.
Great.
I
Everybody.
have a really good storyline for the lesbians.
Oh, good.
Hi, Del.
Hey, everybody.
I'm
There
going
were
to share. Michael sent some wonderful pictures.
Oh my God.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, God.
So when you're talking about the room, there it is. There's the Braintrust.
That's great.
There it is.
I recognize us all. Oh, there's Ad. Hi, Adam.
We don't look too different, do we?
No, you look like a
we were
rock
awfully
band.
young there.
No, I think we're still recognizable. Yeah. I
Oh,
think
of course.
we're okay.
It was this windowless room on like the 5th floor of an office building in Beverly
Yes.
Hills. You would never have believed.
But can we just briefly acknowledge that maybe the most successful person there is our little assistant?
Justin.
Justin.
Creates
Spitzer in the
the
green.
store.
Justin did very well.
Yeah, Justin Spitzer. He's a big macher now in Hollywood.
What is
Yeah.
he doing now?
What is he doing?
Oh, he
Well,
created
he
a
was-
superstore.
Superstore. His
When
main.
he was our assistant, the writer's
Oh,
assistant,
Superstore.
he
Okay.
was very much into Scrubs. That was his dream. He wanted to be on Scrubs, and he did. He wrote a script. He got into Scrubs. The last, I think he became a co-executive producer, and he went on to The Office and became a co-executive producer and produced what's called Big Store.
Superstore.
Superstore. It's in like what? It's 7th or 8th year now.
Yeah, Mark
He's just left the show to do other projects now. It's still going, but he's not running it.
So, all right. So, Michael and Brad and Del. So you joined third season, yes? Or did
No.
some of you come in second? Third season, right?
I was in the second season.
You were second season. That's right, Michael.
Yeah. All of the writers of the first season were not invited back, and there were about 5 of us, I think, who were brought into the second season. And yeah, I remember I was just quaking in my boots those first months as well, especially, you know.
Did you watch the show in the first season? Did you know the show
Yes,
before you
but
came
when
aboard?
I was interviewed for the show, it hadn't aired yet.
Right.
Because as you know, I mean, it's more common now as streaming, but at that time, you guys had almost finished filming before the season 1 dropped.
Right.
So they were already sort of looking at options, and I think it was when Dan and Ron were still in Toronto that I had I met mostly with Ron, and I was totally intimidated by Dan. I totally got them backwards.
Yeah.
But the first time,
Me?
In terms of who to be intimidated by, you mean?
Yeah.
yeah. I
What
thought,
intimidated you,
I thought Ron was
Michael? What intimidated you about?
Wait a minute.
Why was I intimidating to you?
You were in the edit suite, and Ron just brought you through, brought me through to just sort of like shake your hand kind of thing. Yeah, you were just like super, I just thought, oh my gosh, he's like I don't know what. Anyway, that was quickly disabused of that.
Can I just say one thing before we go on? I don't want
Yes.
to usurp our host, but I just wanted to say that these 3 are not only brilliant writers, all 3 of them individually, but they're wonderful human beings. So glad they came into our life. And I just really have to say that, and continue to be brilliant and wonderful people.
I agree.
All right, go on,
I
Mike.
concur as well. No, please.
If I'm not too intimidating, Michael, go on.
Well, can I say that
Yes, Del.
it is an amazing experience. I've done a lot of, enough TV, and to work for these two men was just a dream. It's like in my house, if I could give you a tour, I only have, my stuff on the wall, except one other piece of work, and that's the big poster of Queer as Folk, because it was such a pleasure to work for this show and an amazing cast. It was an amazing experience, and this writing team, we remained friends. So
True.
I
Yeah.
had fun, had lots of fun.
I've never had a better job, to be completely honest with you.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, the only notes we got were for more lesbian sex. I mean, that's,
And that was from me.
exactly. We've all worked for networks before. We know what notes are like. So that was quite amazing. And it was, I still miss you guys, but I miss that room and that mix of personalities and the way we would segue actual issues that we were dealing with into the story and into the characters to make them something. I mean, we shared a lot of very intimate things with one another that I think may have helped with that bonding process that we have.
Could you talk a little bit about that too? So for, especially for a lot of the fans who are going to be watching this, who, what is it like start of the season? Like in that picture I just showed, we saw on the background, there's a board and you had all the characters' names up there and it looked like you were coming up with storylines for everybody maybe. So give me like start of a season, you guys all get together in the room. What are you sharing? How much has already been planned out by you, Dan and Ron, before you bring the writers together? Is it completely from scratch? Like, how do you start, say, the third season?
Well, if I may begin, and I don't want to usurp this, as I said,
No,
everyone to come in. But what we would do when we'd have our hiatus, which was only for like 2 weeks, the actors had much longer. The writers actually had a little longer. But Ron and I only had 2 weeks, and we would spend those 2 weeks trying to map out the storyline, the overall arcs for the season. And we'd come into the writer's room and basically we would say, this is what we're thinking of, that Brian and Justin are here and whatever. We just talk about the characters and everybody would contribute. And what you saw in that photo is each episode, we would outline the board. It was divided into 3 acts. If you do broadcast, it's usually 4 acts because of the commercials, but this was sort of like a little film every week. So it was 3 acts, and we would just start from there, right, Ron?
Yeah, I think it's important to back up and just say that all of us broke every episode together, and breaking an episode is sort of taking those sort of big picture character arcs and drilling down into what are the actual scenes in what order in every episode. And so we would do that together regardless of whose name was going to be on the script. And I think often we would be well into the process before we even knew whose script an episode was going to be written by.
I mean, I was just stunned at the beginning when I first started that first season. And I have to say, by the way, that Swoosie Kurtz got me that job because I directed her in a little movie that in Australia, and I had a play called Southern Baptist Sissies, and she called Ron and Dan. She was my manager, and I told them to go see my play.
Yeah, she said she could get 35%. That was.
I feel like I owe Swoosie some money.
Yeah,
and now
we paid her off.
Anyway, but one thing that I loved about this room and that I look back and people go, oh, I saw your credit on this particular episode. And like Michael said, we were such collaborators. I don't remember having written that episode because Ron or Dan would just say, okay, you're up, Del. This is your episode. And then I'd go off and write, and then we'd pass it back to Ron and Dan. And next time we saw it, it was on the air. You know?
I would like to say as well that,
like a wheel.
sorry.
It's sort of like a rotation, and then everybody got their turn. But what Mike was saying is right. We broke all these episodes together. It was a very collaborative experience, and I agree with Brad. Well, I agree with everyone. It was like sort of like a once in a lifetime experience because we weren't just writers. We were friends, and we were also members of a group therapy session that lasted for several years. I mean, we know everything, I think, or pretty much everything.
So many times each of us would start by saying, "I've never told anybody this before," but,
Yeah.
and we would sort of delve really deeply into our experiences.
Can you give an example of that? Is that something you're comfortable with? Any of you giving an example?
Well, maybe not so much an example, but what really worked for me was that Dan and Ron came in with ideas, and very specific ones, but they were also open to opening those ideas up and doing something else with them. If you remember, in fact, Scott, with your storyline, originally the idea was that he was going to get hooked on Percocet.
Oh.
And that was going to be his drug problem. And we all bashed that around in the room for a day and kind of went, Percocet, you get high, you're boring, you sleep, you fall on the floor. How about if he got on crystal, which is a big problem in our community? And that's a lot more interesting because there's sex and all kinds of acting out and things like that. And so it went in that direction. Even though it had come in as another idea of addiction, we expanded on that through all of us talking together in the room.
And then a great example, I think, is Michael with brought in his stories about the fairies, and we put that into the fairy convention. And then I started getting a lot of shots in my face, and your character was Ron said, oh, Ted should be worried about getting old like Dell.
Shots in your face.
So I have you to thank for that, Del.
I would come in with a lot of bruises. I found a doctor up in Toronto.
Del, I wasn't sure what kind of shots you were talking about, so
right.
Right, Ron? Right, Ron? You there was a little inspiration of the
well, and also
you mean Restylane?
Yes.
First I'm thinking shots drinking, then I'm thinking
no.
Oh yes, our little experience getting rested. Boy, it did a lot of good, didn't it?
Just to talk about craft a little bit more around this, I think one of the things that was remarkable about the show was that list that Dan was talking about that we would do at the beginning of the season, it was open-ended. There were stories that we thought would take 6 episodes to play out, and we would be like, by the end of 1 hour, we'd be like, I think we're good with this. And then there would be, one-night stands that once we started to dig into them and explore them, we felt like this merited season-long arc. So we were always being surprised by our own storytelling as well. That
if I could just go
in knowing exactly how things would end, who would do what, exactly when and I think that it's a scarier way to write, because I think that Ron and Dan's kind of credo was to throw everything at this episode that we're working on now. Don't worry about next week. Give it your all and put in every good idea you have now. Don't save it. And what that means is you're always in this sense of you don't know what's happening next. You don't know if you can top the storytelling that you've just achieved. And so we were as surprised as the audiences were. There's not a sense of inevitability, I think, with a lot of the stories. And to the degree that there isn't that sense of, oh, I can see it coming a mile away, it's because we couldn't see it coming. We kept allowing the characters to kind of surprise us. And that, it made for some challenging times where we really were staring at that blank slate, trying to figure out what happens next. But I think the results are, immeasurably better. And I think we've all been really influenced. The three of us here have been really influenced by that courage of storytelling.
I think, Scott, your storyline's a perfect example because, when we landed on the notion of crystal meth, I don't think any of us knew where it was going to go and how long it would go on. I don't think any of us knew it would continue on into a second season. We didn't foresee how deep we would go into that particular story. And like Michael said, some stories, you said, okay, that's enough of that. Other storylines, like the crystal meth story, we found so much more in it than we ever expected.
Because it affected all the characters, not just him.
Yeah, and we didn't see how it was going to keep expanding and affect everybody in the story. It wasn't just your problem. It turned into I mean, not your problem, Ted's problem, how it just kept growing and expanding. And it brought in so many ancillary storylines. And
I remember us debating how were we going to send him to his bottom, you know, and exploring like how low can he go and what will be the final thing that terrifies.
Oh, that's when they filmed it.
Yeah. And we know how hard it was on you personally to live in that story for as long as you did, which we should all thank you for, because
you did a brilliant job.
That was extremely painful, and that was one of the most important storylines we told. And
but what I think also, Ron, what you did, and Dan, what y'all did, you did, and I still use it in my writing today, you challenged us to scratch deeper into the psychology of these characters and to really understand what motivated Ted to get to that, you know, and how did he get to here? And that
is part of our process as a group. That's part of what we're talking about, how we exposed our own insecurities and fears and feelings that we shared in that room, and that led to finding those aspects of the character. I mean, if we hadn't talked through personal stuff ourselves, and I'm not saying our own addictions, because we wouldn't have addictions, but you can certainly imagine going there. That's what a writer does. You imagine going there. And so we talked about so many personal things that became part of the story, or we brought things to the table that others of us didn't know, like about the fairy convention or about bug chasers. I never heard of a bug chaser until we started talking about it in the room.
I want to go back to something Michael said, because on both of our series, Sisters and Queer as Folk, you know, networks demand what's called a Bible. They want to know and they want it written down, what every episode, where it's leading. And we refuse to do that on both shows, because the stories are like living organisms in a way. They dictate to you. The characters will tell you what to do. In fact, I remember, I don't know if it was the bug chasing storyline or not, but we were doing a story for I think it was for Justin. And at one point we said, wait a minute, this shouldn't be for Justin. This should be for Ben or whatever. That may not be, my memory may not be correct in that, but we would change it. It was always very flexible, and it was very important that it be that, because things did change. And one episode, as Michael said, we'd say, wait a minute, we don't need to go further in this. So if we had written everything down in stone, it wouldn't have been, and to go back to your point, is that we were very much into what was happening every day, and the bug chaser thing, which we got a lot of flack for. And we got a lot of flack for that story where Debbie would not allow Michael to date Ben. And yet it was true. And in fact, it was good for us. The controversy was good for us.
We also got a lot of flack for when Lindsay had the affair with the man.
Yes.
We got a lot of flack for that one. But what I loved about what Ron and Dan did, and that challenged all of us, is that never shy away from the flaws of these characters. They are flawed human beings, and I think that one of the things that made the series controversial on one hand, but successful on the other, was that we told the truth.
Right.
We didn't shy away from true stories.
I think we told the truth too, and I think that upset a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think what confused people too was that they're used to television following a particular formula that keeps them comfortable all the time. So the characters you meet in the first episode are the characters who are there for the rest of the season. But in fact, our characters evolved and changed and grew and became very different people by the end. And a lot of people are not very comfortable with that kind of thing on TV.
And they were flawed. They were flawed characters.
No, people want to see the same person week after week in most shows, and they don't change. And that is not what we did.
And again, it's like to have the perspective that this was 20 years ago when this started, and you know, we had essentially The Sopranos was the only show that had an anti-hero kind of thing. What you all were doing was so groundbreaking. I mean, now we're used to it with Breaking Bad and all these shows with all these super flawed characters that you're getting.
Two things to that. Two things. One is that I think what we would do, it goes back to the fact that we were sharing our own stories and the stories of people that we knew individually. So there was some sense of, paying attention to the conversations that were happening, but
everybody, talked to,
our own lives, and people wanted to talk to us. And I think, I remember a feeling that we would have at the start of every season, where it's almost like, as writers, we were individually going off, having conversations, having life experiences, paying attention to the world around us, and sort of bringing treasures back to the room and saying, is this useful? Is this interesting? The bug chaser thing, I remember I had seen this documentary that was about just that, and we sort of talked about it from there. But the other thing I will say around the anti-hero, and God knows how we would navigate this in today's world of live streaming or live tweeting and things like that. But Ron and Dan were adamant that there was so much pressure from the fan base that they wanted certain things to happen. Just let these two people love each other. Just let this person be, quote, nice. Make those two people break up. They would drive people crazy that they wouldn't be getting what they wanted. And I have a vivid memory of Dan talking about how it doesn't matter, or they'd hate a character. And it was about, I remember Dan saying, it doesn't matter why they're watching, it's that they're watching. And they might not know it, but they might be watching this show because Brian pushes the buttons, because this relationship is so frustrating. And that an audience is not the guy, as long as they are watching, that's all you have to worry about. And then it's up to us to give the stories that we feel these characters merit, not what an audience tells the showrunners they want to see. And I think that bedrock philosophy around not sort of pleasing the audience is why those characters are so enduring.
I agree. And those gray qualities that you talk about, I mean, for the cast, I know we talked about it all the time. What we loved about the characters were how gray they were. There was no black or white. You could be the best friend in the world to someone 1 minute and then a complete shit the next second. And that's
to
Brad's point, I think, that people weren't used to that.
And speaking of the real writing staff, Dan, the thing is, we all come from the theater.
Yes.
All of us come from the theater. So we are used to being able to do what we want to do as writers, and we're used to taking real risks. And I think that the fact that we took our theatrical experience and brought it to another medium was a big part of why we were not afraid of what we were doing. And also, we were all fairly well-established writers at the time.
And I think it was one of our biggest problems, because people are used to a certain television reality, which of course isn't real at all. There's nothing real about what you're seeing on TV. It's as totally artificial as anything. But they're used to TV reality. So bringing our experiences from the theater, we spoke in a language of heightened reality. We mixed humor and drama. And one wonderful thing about everyone in the room is that they are truly hilariously funny. All of them are really funny people. I mean, one of the joys of the room is spending time with people who have a sense of humor. I don't know how people even get through their lives without a sense of humor or laughing. I mean, my God, you die. So I would think we were making each other laugh constantly. And I think what people who watch the show may have not had a lot of experience seeing is, I think of the show as a comedy drama. I think there was as much funny stuff in our show, and I think we could talk about that too, as there was serious stuff. And like you were saying, each week, you didn't know what you were going to get. One week it would be funny, next week it'd be tragedy, constantly mixing it up. And
Ted is a perfect embodiment, I think, of that value. I mean, your skills as an actor, Scott, but also just the way that he
and when you write comedy right away, it's not real because nobody in real life is that funny all the time.
Hey.
And of course the stories are going to be over the top because comedy is over the top.
Right.
And that's what it is. So yeah, we spoke in what Brad was saying was a theatrical language that we brought to a medium that is not inherently theatrical.
But I will say also, though, I mean, having performed some of the more comic aspects of things, there's some stuff that was definitely over the top. But one of my fondest memories is there was a lot of stuff that if you played it really honestly and dramatically, it was funny, but you didn't even think of it that way. And one of my fondest memories is when you talked about that speakerphone when we would do the table reads, and we would have that speakerphone on the table read in the dining room up in Toronto, and you all would be back in Los Angeles. I have very distinct memories of doing read-throughs and reading a scene that I thought was kind of dramatic and just hearing out of the speakerphone the laughter of all of you guys. And that made me so happy. It's like, oh, I didn't even know that was funny. Oh, that's great. Okay, good.
The comedy, some of your stuff with Peter, with Emmett,
Yeah.
I treasure that stuff. I love the storyline where you took Viagra and it wouldn't go down. That was
that shot where the doctor in the silhouette just.
Oh, yes, right.
Yeah, and the silhouette. We couldn't show an erection on screen, but we did through a curtain in silhouette. And when you and Peter were teaching Debbie how to give a blowjob, and when the cop, what's his name?
Horvath.
Horvath broke up with her because he thought she was a prostitute. And Emmett was so touched by that. He said, oh, I'm so proud. I mean, I treasure those scenes, It was just glorious. I treasure them as much as all the issues that we got to write about, which we might like to talk about a little, because I think we all realized this may be our only shot at writing about these things that affect gay people. And for us, it was our only chance to write about all those things that were so important and had to be said that no one had addressed on TV. And we did that. I think that is really important.
Let me ask you a couple more questions, and for all of you, can you think of, do you each have a storyline or something you pitched that either got laughed out of the room, or there's like, what's the most absurd storyline you came up with that you thought was brilliant at the time that just didn't happen? Brad?
Let me go first, because it was my first day in the room. People didn't really know me. I didn't really know anyone. And I thought, well, I've got to have a really good pitch for tomorrow, something that really makes them wake up and see me as I am. So I pitched that Ted gets a dog and he loves it so much that Emmett becomes convinced he's into canine and having sex with the dog. So the whole cast has to stage an intervention to make him stop fucking the dog, when in fact he's not even doing it. And the silence that fell over the room when I finished that pitch.
I don't remember this at all.
Well, the problem with the story was that he wasn't.
Well, I know, yes.
That's why we rejected it. It just
I should have been having sex with the
So to
dog.
speak.
And we,
See, we can do this in the writer's room, and
Fool around and be
there was
silly
that
and
freedom
obscene.
and say things that you know perfectly well.
You might be arrested for it
And
today.
that the whole world would come down on you if God forbid they heard you say that
it's
stuff.
safety. It was a sense of safety in the room.
Safety,
It'd be
yes.
hard to kind of do the flow charts of these, but there were so many times where a quote bad idea actually led us to the final idea. So that cause so much of writing is solving problems, and I think what we all felt safe enough in doing was proposing something, even if we know it's not going to get us to the solution. It isn't the solution, but it might get us to the solution. And it was that sense of kind of communal foraging for the final idea. And so
Safety is a good word, because it's very important in a safe place.
Yeah. And so many times you sort of get to 5 o'clock and you'd be like, this is good. And it all started because that silly idea that then somebody picked up on and rolled with and had a story on and built and supported. And so the you know, that's just writing. I mean, the final words on the page are really just the tip of the iceberg.
But it also was the atmosphere, fellow writers, that Ron and Dan allowed us. I mean, I feel like that the atmosphere was that we were free. We never felt censored ever.
We were allowed to play. We were allowed to have fun. We'd come up with those stupid ideas, as Michael says, and they would go, that's a stupid idea, but let's play with it for a while. And we'd toss it back and forth, and we'd laugh a lot. And eventually we would hone it and shape it into something that was right for the show. But it almost always came from a really ludicrous proposal in the beginning.
Yeah, you know, we were working, one of the things that was happening at the time we were working, correct me if I'm wrong, was when that writer's assistant sued on Friends.
Oh, yes.
And there was all this talk of, you know, like impeccable political correctness in writers' rooms, and this conversation that was being had, and like the front page of just art sections across the country, that like you can't get to where you can't land on what the solution is until you've gone beyond it before, and that sense of pushing the boundary and just going to the limit and then pulling back is necessary. And I remember I have a recollection of us sort of talking about that in the context of our room and being like, this, we would all, you know, be in jail right now if.
Yeah, but we were never singling out someone in the room. We were never attacking someone specifically for their race or their gender or whatever. We were making jokes about everything to find a way towards something. And we all understood that shorthand. You know, we had great trust in one another, that it wasn't going to be someone ratting you out or getting offended or whatever, because we were all speaking the same language.
And those martinis helped, didn't it?
I never had a martini with you bitches.
Did you find it hard because you've all you know, you've gone on to other things, working on other staffs or on your own shows? Was it hard? Because I know it was, for me as an actor, going to other sets after Queer as Folk said, I sometimes got in trouble because I was used to things being a certain way on our set. Do you find it challenging going to other writing rooms after working, you know, under the tutelage of Dan and Ron?
We didn't know how good we had it.
For me, it's you know, it's always been the notes. It was before and it was after, but it was that one period where it was like we could just sail creatively. We could just sail because we were given that permission. And Ron and Dan, if there was any interference from the network, they would fight. Mm-hmm. They would fight for the show and what was right for the show. And you just, as we said, we just felt safe.
We were protected from a lot of it as well. Like, I mean, I think it was only later when I started show running when I really came to appreciate the immense pressure that Ron and Dan, you were under, that you found a way of keeping it out of the writer's room. And so we were still able to be in this place of kind of fecund creativity, and you know, there were battles you were fighting outside of that room that we were largely protected from. And I think that's unusual. Back to your question, Scott, I think in most cases, showrunners just don't have the capacity to leave it at the door. And so they're taking it out on their crew, on their writers. Sure. There isn't, you know, generally the level of, I think it just boils down to a kind of trust and confidence in themselves as showrunners that allowed us to sort of feel as safe. But now, you know, we've all also been in other experiences where we've been running a room, and I think that those values have extended to the way that we,
absolutely.
You know, yes. Oh my God. Yeah. Such an influence on the way I break story. Such and the psychology. I always say we were challenged so much to know the psychology of every single moment and every single character. And I teach now, you know, when I teach writing, that's one of the things I I do. So thank you. I'm looking down as if you're there, but thank you so much, Ron and Dan, for the teaching experiences and for the job. And you know, it was.
Thank you, guys. It's very touching. It really means a lot to us.
Thank you. It was just this once in a lifetime experience for us. I don't think we had ever shared with other writers what we shared with these wonderful people for those years. And that was the real joy of the show for Dan and me. That's why we wanted this particular reunion. When you called and said, who do you like to be put together with? There was no thought behind it at all. Of course, it would be our writer's room, and Del and Brad and Michael. This would, of course, be who we wanted to be with, and to remember that safe place where we could say anything and be silly and be offensive and say whatever we wanted, and know, you know, the axe would never fall. I think going into the outside world again was always hard for me to censor myself, to realize, you know, I couldn't say naughty things.
So tell them about the airport
because
story.
you know, naughty things would be taken as horribly offensive, and you want to say, well, I was just being silly, for God's sake. You couldn't do it. It was so hard to
and the
switch.
double entendres, it took a long time. We were in the airport once because we had to travel back and forth, obviously, and we would be writing all the time in the plane. We've been sitting in the airport, and Ron and I are sort of mapping out a scene.
God.
And I remember saying something like, no, he can't, he should fuck him up the ass. He should not do that. And all of a sudden he's looking and saying, Ron, Dan, there are people, and people are looking at us. And the work mode was with us. I just want to say also.
We're saying it's our job.
Yeah, we're working. We're working.
You know?
I just wanted to say that as proud as we are of what became on screen, the product on screen. I don't mean to call it product, it's terrible. I mean the films. What we're also most proud of is the workings behind the scenes. And that includes not just the writers, but the cast, the crew. On both of our series, you know, a lot of people wouldn't leave. They'd get other jobs and say, well, I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave Queer as Folk. I don't want to leave Sisters. We like working with you. And as much as we push them out of the nest because they had to advance themselves, it really makes us feel good that we know that behind the scenes, it was a great working experience, because, you know, anyone can put up with assholes for a couple of months, like on a film or a TV movie or whatever. But when you're working for years and you're committing yourself for years and giving some of the best years of your creative life to a project, you have to want to come to work. You have to want to be there. And that's hopefully what we did.
It's just thinking of the people you're working with as they know stuff that you don't know. You know, I don't know how to do anything else on this show except write. So why wouldn't we be respectful of what everybody else can do, you know? And to listen to everybody and to think of it as a collaboration, which is, again, something coming from the theater. That was lesson number one in the theater. This is a collaborative art form, or you don't want to be that pretentious, experience. It is a collaborative experience. I don't know how other TV shows work. Maybe there's that hierarchy, but I think I hope what everyone felt was, you know, that we weren't playing the role of being the boss, you know, sitting behind our desk with the door closed and ordering people around. I mean, the whole thing was to share the experience.
And that photo that you showed, just an example of that. You saw it wasn't just the writers in the writers' room. It was Rod, who was our script supervisor, Justin, who was our assistant, Adam Newman, who was there, who was a co-producer, and any idea that came up, they were. What was that, Brad? Any idea that came up, it was a good idea. We took it. We encouraged them. We didn't say, "Look,
Sure.
just go get us coffee and shut up." It was never like that.
No.
Brad, what were you going to say?
I was going to say Adam's contribution. He almost was a writer on the show. I mean, he came at it from a different perspective, but I always missed him when he wasn't in the room.
Yeah.
He brought a whole other perspective to it,
Yeah,
as did Justin and as did Rod. You know, and so their contributions and their opinions were valid and sought out by us.
Right. Right.
And yeah, I'm sorry Adam isn't with us because he was a very important part of the process.
He sent a text just before this to me to send you all his love. He was sorry.
Oh, good.
Sorry he couldn't do it today, but he sends his
Our love back. You know, going back to something you said at the beginning of our conversation was, you know, in some ways I don't know if we were ahead of the curve or whatever, or prescient, but sometimes we did tell stories that came to be true years later, that at the time were looked at as over-the-top stories. I mean, certainly how we ended the show with the bombing of Babylon came true.
Unfortunately.
Many, many years later. I don't know where that came from, our collective unconscious, or just a horrible coincidence. I don't know why that is, but
well, it's that deep, dark fear, right, of everybody in that community, especially, and taking it to that dramatic level. You could see that this is possible, this could happen. That kind of hate exists out there then, and even still.
And even still is a big, because I think so much of what we did, I could say even still, even though, you know, some people I've heard say, oh, well, the show is dated, and I want to know, how is it dated? I mean, I miss the good news that there's no longer HIV or AIDS, or that people are no longer having unsafe sex. I miss the news that gay people are no longer, you know, being threatened or being bashed or whatever. And I didn't hear that story. I missed the story about parents throwing their kids out in the street, or I missed all those stories that, you know, that no longer exists. That's wonderful news. So how other than Grindr, you know, yeah, you can get married, but that's not the be all and end all of gay life. You know, that's not it. That's not enough. All these
So
other.
Bob and Dan, I want you to know that, you know, when we were doing the show, my daughters were just really young, and they're now 27 and 30. And recently, Caroline binged the whole show, and I'm like a new hero to her. She just
Really
felt it was so current, and just could not believe that it was so far ahead of its time.
I have gay young friends, not just gay ones, who've watched the series as well, and they actually borrow my discs and go and binge on the whole thing, and they say the same thing. They say, why isn't there something like this on TV now? How did you guys get away with this?
I don't know.
I don't know how we got away with it. But
A miracle.
How do you guys feel? Do you think the show's dated? In what way do you think it's dated? Or
I think it's to say it's dated means it has no relevance today, and I think that's absolutely not true. It is very much of its time. There are certain conversations happening in that wouldn't happen now, but there's a way into relevance I think at every turn. And for me, I think the early seasons we were so excited by by that sort of sense of permission of what we could talk about, and we were really exploring the limits of that. And another piece of sort of historical something that was happening at the time when we were writing it was that Bush got reelected.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what happened when to the storytelling around that time was a different layer. We were still a fun, sexy, button-pushing show, but we were talking in the writer's room sometimes 45 minutes in the morning before we got any work, quote, got any work done. And there was a real sense of despair for the nation, which now seems quaint, frankly.
Yes.
And
back there
was a point at which I remember Ron and Dan were saying, you know, we can talk about these things on the show. Like, no one is stopping us. We will never have this sense of not being censored in the making of a TV show again. Like, we'll all, you know, work on shows and we'll all make more television, but this is a real rare opportunity. And so we were starting to be able to sort of delve into things that weren't being talked about on other shows, not because we were showing, you know, full frontal nudity or butt sex or something like that, but it was because we were talking about dark political forces. We were talking about the ways that power works in America. And I think that stuff is very relevant to today. So I would just
and the thing, I
Michael
mean,
made an important point that there was that halfway point in the show where the country really changed. Yes, we started out doing a fun, sexy show, dealing with issues. I mean, even up front, we had gay bashing, we had parental rejection, we dealt with a lot of things. But suddenly there was that halfway point when things became much more political and more threatening. And we had to address what was going on. And in certain ways, it feels like those times are coming back, those bad times, unfortunately.
Coming back, they're here.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're in it.
And that's where to me there's nothing dated. I think it's a blueprint for survival, to tell you the truth. I think that's what
I'm fearful that things are going to. I fear that things can get worse. Any day.
Well, I think that's why. I mean, it's as we've learned, you have to remain vigilant. You can't get complacent as we got in this country about voting and taking care of our democracy. And I wonder, going to what Della said and Brad and Michael, as a cast member of the show, so being, the more public face of it and hearing more directly from fans, again, this is 20 years since we started, 15 years since we went off the air, and all over the world. I mean, not just here, I mean, Asia, all throughout Europe, Australia, Russia, places where it's still much harder to be gay, even than in the United States right now. They get bootleg copies of this show still. The show still has that rebellious rock and roll spirit to younger kids. I mean, it's kids in their 20s, some teenagers. I had someone send me an email about this event saying, would this be appropriate for teens? Because I know someone want to watch. I was like, well, if they watch the show, they can watch this, I'm sure. So, I mean, that has to, well, tell me how do you feel about that?
About
the fact that the show still has that effect?
Well, I think the reason it does is because it was honest and courageous. And I also, I hadn't seen the show in years and years. And I sort of say to Ron that Queer as Folk is sort of our Christmas carol, because every spring, Gay Pride, Showtime runs the whole series. And this past year, Ron and I watched most of it, actually. We were like fans. We kept saying, all right, I'm going to watch one episode and that'll be it. No, I want to see the next one. And what struck me was how pertinent it was, how relevant it remained, with the exception of maybe some hairstyles or wardrobe, whatever. But
cell phones too.
It really maintained that. And what?
And
what?
Cell phones.
The cell phones.
Oh, yeah.
The clamshells instead of the iPhones. But in answer to your question, I think that when something is, it's why certain novels, books remain relevant also, because they're honest, they're true. And I think even though there may be another Queer as Folk in the future, I don't think it'll ever have the impact that this Queer as Folk had. I don't think there'll ever be another Queer as Folk like our Queer as Folk.
It existed in a specific time. There were other gay shows too. It seemed to be a moment in time where that was happening for whatever reason, a convergence of things beyond what we can understand. But I don't know that moment is going to repeat itself in any way. That fertile ground that this grew out of, along with these other shows.
Well, because it's not as exotic. It's not as exotic. I think that when we went on the air, this was a very intriguing, exotic world for people. But now I think with same-sex marriage, with a lot of characters on film and TV being gay, I don't think it has quite the impact that ours did in that window of time.
Maybe there isn't a gay community there the way there was when we wrote the show. Maybe as like on TV shows, gay people are filtered into the stream of
normal society.
Yeah, normal society. Yeah, you're now part of the mainstream. You're not separate. The way the community that we showed was separate. Although I don't know that for a fact. I mean, some people say, well, they still live in West Hollywood with all their friends, and it doesn't sound, I guess it's a choice. I guess you can choose maybe where you want to live and how you want to live, maybe a little more free. You don't have to cluster in West Hollywood or a particular area and just
And the
hang out.
population is more accepting of it, of the gay community.
Yeah, but I think, you know, as Scott was saying, gay issues are very different all around the world, and we're not all at the same place. And Queer as Folk was a show about the queer community at a particular point in time and development. And that time is still happening in Russia, in South America, in places like that, where they are only getting to that point. And I notice this because they produce my plays down there a lot now too, where the queer community is getting vocal enough and confident enough to demand their own stories and their own work the same way we did in the last quarter of the 20th century. So I think on that level, it is always germane to somebody somewhere, depending on what they're going through and where they are in their development.
Mm-hmm. Well put, very well put, Brian.
But we still want our stories, don't we?
Mm-hmm. I think we do.
I think they're necessary, and they still speak to such a wide audience too. I mean, you know, that so much of the fan base is not even gay who's watching this show. I think, you know, when you're talking about the education value of the show, the getting rid of a phobia by letting people learn about a world that they didn't know about, I think the show helped enormously with that and continues to do that. I think that's partially why, you know, as Peter always said, they came for the queer, they stayed for the folk. And I think
I agree with you. And I think one of the surprises to all of us was finding out who actually watched our show. I was very happy that a large percent of the people who watched our show, maybe the majority of people who watched our show are women, because maybe those women have kids, or maybe those women one day will have kids, and maybe those kids are gay or will be gay. And I'm really happy that they saw our show, because maybe they could absorb something from watching it, some sort of kindness or compassion to pass on to their kids.
I'm sure you affected the membership levels of PFLAG.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think that was one of those, you know, unexpected things that happen from media, that you don't know the repercussions of the message you're going to send out. The medium is the message, as some Canadian professor said a very long time ago. I think what was his name?
Marshall McLuhan.
Anyway, but part of the medium is the message, is that the message is often something that you don't know is going to happen as a result of what you're putting out there. And I think it was a very unexpected part of our message that a large female audience.
But I wanted to sort of echo some of that to circle back to the not giving the audience what they claim they wanted. For example, I mean, Brian was such a controversial character, and I can't tell you, whenever people found out that I wrote on the show, I got one of two responses. One was, who's gay, which actors are gay and which aren't? And the second was, I can't stand Brian. And I would want to interrogate that a bit, because, you know, I think there's a lot to really admire about Brian, but he pushed buttons for people. And I think what's happened now is that the world's caught up to see Brian for the powerful person he is. And what was happening when it was first airing was that the queer audience was very uncomfortable about the truth-telling that the story was doing. That we were really only used to two types of depictions, in my view. One was the sort of insulting, queer minstrel show type of version of representation, and the other was sort of the poster child. And this show wasn't interested in either of those. And so it was very uncomfortable for queer people to see themselves presented knowing that straight people were watching this. I had a friend when I got the job, he was so excited. He told his friends at work that I would be writing on the second season, and Queer as Folk happened to be on that night, the first season, and it was the infamous bathhouse. I mean, there were many bathhouse stories, but of course the infamous first season bathhouse storyline. And he was outraged that that would be on the show. He told me that the next day, and I said, "But Guy, you go to the baths like 2 or 3 times a week."
Whoa.
And he was like, "Well, I don't want them knowing that."
Yeah.
And
Many
that
times.
to me encapsulates the tension that the show had. And I think as a community, we're now able to appreciate it without getting all squirrely about it, about how we're being perceived, because there's been so many other things in context.
Yeah, there was, we didn't talk about that, but there was a lot of negative from the gay community. I mean, I would go to, I remember being at a pool party or a party in Malibu, and some guy comes up to me and he goes, "Somebody just told me that you wrote for Queer as Folk." And, just the way he said it, I thought, oh, this isn't going to go well. And I said, "Yes, I do. And I'm very proud of that." And he goes, "Well, you don't represent me. I just want you to know that that show makes us look bad, and that does not represent me." And I said, "Well, go and write your own fucking show then that represents you, because it represents a lot of people. Whether you like it or not, it represents a lot of people."
I developed a standard response to that. When people said to me that show doesn't represent me, I would say, yes, people who don't see themselves represented on TV are usually boring people. That's why they're not there.
Yay!
Always got to laugh.
Your
Showtime always had a disclosure at the beginning of every episode saying that because of what these guys are saying, the disclosure said, this show is strictly about a small group of friends in Pittsburgh. It does not represent every gay person in every gay community, which I thought was ridiculous.
That's how we did Gay as Blazes. Remember? We sort of that, right?
Don't you remember the last night we all went out together and we were dying to go to Remington's, the strip bar, and we were sitting at the table and the little twink waiter came by and went, "Oh, what are you guys doing? Why are you here?" And someone said, "Oh, we work on Queer as Folk." And he said, "Oh, I don't like that show." And I said, "Well, we didn't make it for you." Remember that? It happened.
I remember we went there. That's right. Remington.
Had a horrible time, yeah.
We should have used that storyline about some twink who works in a strip bar who finds some shit.
I think we did.
But Gay as Blazes was definitely our response. And I just loved doing Gay as Blazes. It was terrific.
I did too. So funny.
We didn't make a lot of friends. We didn't make a lot of friends in the community here.
We had each other.
Right.
I have to say, Brad is like the embodiment of Brian. I mean, he is real life. He will say, and he will tell you the truth in the most.
Well, I'm sometimes nice about it.
I love that about you. I mean, you just say it as it is, and if you can't take it, then that's too fucking bad.
I swear to God,
Brad is always honest. Brad is always honest.
And Brian was always honest. Brian never lied. He was also very loving and supportive of all of his friends. I found him to be a very admirable character. I loved writing. And I think in our own ways, Michael and Dell, all of us had that Brian element, that we told the truth. And if we offended you, too bad.
Well, we always said, Ron and I at the very beginning said to each other, if we don't get criticized, if we don't get criticized and start winning awards for this, we're doing the wrong thing. So we have to know that we have to be brave and bold and take the criticism. We knew it at the beginning. We knew it. Yeah. And Russell Davies told us that too.
Well, the same thing happened to him too, and he warned us what would happen to us, and indeed it did. Yeah.
Well, I'm so grateful to you all for doing this today. I'm grateful on behalf of the whole cast, of course. It was, an honor for us to get to breathe some life into all the words you created, and that's gave us the strength to do what we did. It was, oddly enough, the whole cast was mostly theatrical too, came from theater. I think that nature, or that notion of ensemble and collaboration was there from the beginning, and you all were such an important part of that for all of us. And I really wanted the fans who are going to watch this event, hopefully, to get to know you all some more too, because they see your names go by in the credit and they don't know what you did. And I wanted them to have a feeling that, we don't just, we don't go out there and make up these words.
I love you all. I miss you so much. Being together like this is so amazing. I wish we could be together. Really.
We'll stay in touch. We'll always keep in touch.
Let's just say to all the fans, thank you.
Yes.
For your years of love and support
and
for
devotion
us.
To the show.
And let's also wish all of you good health.
Stay safe.
Be safe. Be well in these very, very bad times and
unimaginable times.
And we all have each other, and
we'll get through it together.
We will.
As I say, we will
so
get through
thank you. We love you, and be well.
Yeah.
And donate.
And we love all of you. So we love all of you so much.
Yes.
And miss you so much.
We love you back.
But we'll be in touch. Definitely always stay in touch.